In Mapleton, a working-class suburb where American flags hung from porches and kids still rode bikes until streetlights came on, the Miller family home stood as a neighborhood fixture. Not the biggest or fanciest, just a well-maintained two-story colonial with white paint and green shutters at the end of Elmwood Drive. For nearly 30 years, David Miller had lived in that house, raising his son and building his reputation as Mapleton High's beloved football coach. At 55, his salt and pepper hair and weathered face gave him the perfect look of authority. His players called him Coach Dave, and parents trusted him with their sons. 7 consecutive regional championships had made him a local legend. Dave Miller could have coached college ball, people often said. But he stayed here for the kids. That's the kind of man he is. What most didn't mention was how the loss of his wife Martha 3 years ago had visibly aged him. The light in his eyes had dimmed, though his dedication to his team never wavered. If anything, he threw himself more completely into coaching after her passing. The field became his sanctuary when the emptiness of his home became too much to bear. Jason Miller had grown up watching his father shape young men on that football field. Now 30, he'd followed a similar path, becoming an English teacher at the same high school. Where his father was imposing and commanding, Jason was lean and thoughtful, with a quieter approach that made him popular with students who struggled to connect with other teachers. Jason had married Natalie 2 years ago after meeting her at a hospital fundraiser. At 28, Natalie had already established herself as one of the most capable nurses in Mapleton General's intensive care unit. Her calm efficiency during emergencies and genuine compassion made her respected by doctors and beloved by patients' families. When housing prices skyrocketed in Mapleton last year, the practical decision seemed obvious. Instead of renewing the lease on their small apartment, Jason and Natalie accepted David's offer to move into the family home. There was plenty of space since Martha's passing, and the arrangement would allow the young couple to save for a down payment on their own place. Plus, David had said with a rare smile, this old house could use a woman's touch again. Martha Miller's absence still echoed through the rooms she'd once filled with warmth. For 15 months, she had fought pancreatic cancer with stubborn determination. David had transformed their living room into a bedroom so she wouldn't have to struggle with the stairs. Jason had visited daily, often grading papers at her bedside while she drifted in and out of consciousness. The day of her funeral, over 400 people had filled the Methodist church, a testament to a kindergarten teacher who had shaped generations of Mapleton's children. David had stood stoic and unmovable, accepting condolences with handshakes firm enough to mask his trembling. That night, Jason had found him sitting alone in the backyard, staring at nothing, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. I don't know how to be in that house without her, David had confessed, the only time he had openly acknowledged his grief. When Natalie moved in, subtle changes breathed life back into the Miller home. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table each week. The smell of actual cooking, not just reheated takeout, wafted through the rooms. Laughter returned to the kitchen. Natalie took it upon herself to organize the medicine cabinet, update the ancient first aid kit, and establish a proper meal schedule. Without making a show of it, she quietly managed the household in ways neither Miller man had managed since Martha's passing. Her nursing shifts, often 12 hours, sometimes overnight, created an unusual household rhythm. On days when she worked, she'd leave meals prepared with instructions taped to containers. On her days off, she tackled long-neglected household projects, slowly updating rooms that had remained unchanged since the 1990s. Neighbors noticed the transformation. The Miller house, which had grown somehow dimmer after Martha's passing, now had new flower boxes, trimmed hedges, and the sound of music drifting through occasionally open windows. David began hosting the football team's summer barbecues again. From the outside, they were the picture of a successful, multi-generational household. Lisa Abernathy, who lived across the street and had been friends with Martha, remarked to her husband, "It's so good to see David smiling again. That girl is exactly what those men needed." What no one noticed were David's lingering glances when Natalie wasn't looking. The way his eyes followed her around rooms. How he found reasons to be home when she had days off. How he mentioned her in conversations where it wasn't necessary. Natalie says fish oil is good for heart health, he'd tell his assistant coach. Natalie found this great deal on new recliners, he'd tell a neighbor. Natalie thinks we should repaint the kitchen, he'd tell anyone who visited. The name always rolled off his tongue with a slight emphasis that most missed entirely. At the school's fall fundraiser, David stood proudly between Jason and Natalie, his arm casually draped across both their shoulders as they posed for the yearbook photographer. The Miller dynasty, Principal Warren had joked. David had laughed too enthusiastically and pulled Natalie slightly closer. "Family is everything," he'd said, his fingers briefly gripping her shoulder before letting go. That night, Natalie had mentioned to Jason how his father seemed happier, more engaged with life again. "It's like he's finally moving forward," she said, brushing her teeth while Jason read in bed. "I was worried about him when we first moved in. He seemed so lost. But I think having people in the house again has been good for him." Jason had looked up from his book and smiled. "You've been good for him. For both of us, really." Neither of them noticed how David lingered outside their bedroom door, ostensibly on his way to the bathroom, listening to their muffled conversation with an expression that would have concerned them both had they seen it. Something possessive and hungry lurking beneath his coach's disciplined exterior. To everyone in Mapleton, the Millers represented something wholesome and admirable. A family supporting each other through grief, a son following his father's respected path, a caring daughter-in-law breathing new life into their home. The perfect facade was firmly in place. No one suspected what lay beneath. As Jason's coaching responsibilities expanded, his evenings at home grew increasingly rare. Basketball season demanded his presence at practices, games, and strategy sessions that often stretched past 9 o'clock. Natalie's rotating shifts at the hospital created a household schedule where she and David frequently found themselves alone together. At first, these solitary evenings maintained appropriate boundaries, shared meals followed by separate activities in different parts of the house. The shift began subtly. David positioned himself in the kitchen when Natalie prepared dinner, offering casual touches that lingered just a moment too long. When she worked late shifts, she would return home to find him still awake, regardless of the hour, waiting with questions about her day that felt more like interrogations about her whereabouts. Natalie noticed these changes but dismissed them as natural awkwardness. David was lonely, she reasoned. He missed having a woman in the house. His comments about how her blue scrubs complemented her figure or how her laugh reminded him of Martha's were merely innocent observations, not warning signs. She never mentioned these moments to Jason. What would she say? That his father's gaze followed her too intently? That his compliments made her skin crawl? On the night of Mapleton High's regional championship victory, the traditional celebration at Coach Miller's house transformed the familiar space. Bodies pressed together in the living room, music throbbed from speakers, and alcohol flowed freely. Jason, unaccustomed to drinking, accepted congratulatory shots until his speech slurred and his movements grew clumsy. Natalie circulated through the crowd, collecting empty glasses and ensuring everyone had enough food. David appeared at her side repeatedly throughout the evening, refreshing her whiskey before she could decline. The pride of victory had heightened his commanding presence. His hand at the small of her back guided her through crowded rooms. By midnight, most guests had departed. Jason had passed out on the couch, his tall frame awkwardly arranged across cushions too short to accommodate him. Natalie felt the room spinning as she attempted to clean the kitchen. 3 whiskeys had left her uncharacteristically unsteady. David insisted she leave the mess until morning, taking the garbage bag from her hands and replacing it with another drink. Despite her protests, he led her to the den, his arm firmly around her waist. The leather sofa seemed to tilt beneath her as she sat. David settled beside her, his thigh pressed against hers, his voice dropping to a register she'd never heard from him before. When Natalie attempted to stand, the room tilted violently. David's arm encircled her waist, supporting her as they climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Her memories fragmented after that, his hands removing her clothes, her weak protests that seemed to amuse rather than deter him, his weight pressing her into the mattress she shared with his son, his mouth at her ear warning her to be quiet lest she wake Jason sleeping just downstairs. Morning arrived with throbbing temples and fractured images that assembled into a horrifying reality. Natalie lay in bed wearing her nightgown though she had no memory of changing. The tenderness between her legs confirmed what her mind could not fully recall. In the kitchen, David behaved as though nothing had happened, humming while making breakfast, greeting her with casual cheerfulness that made her stomach heave. Jason sat nursing his hangover with black coffee, oblivious to the silent horror unfolding between his wife and father. That afternoon, while Jason slept off his celebration, David cornered Natalie in the laundry room. He spoke of their connection, as though they'd shared something consensual, something inevitable. When Natalie mentioned telling Jason the truth, David's demeanor transformed instantly. His voice hardened as he outlined exactly how such a revelation would appear. The young nurse taking advantage of her lonely father-in-law, the alcohol clouding judgment on both sides, the devastating impact on Jason's career and reputation at the school where both Miller men were beloved figures. No one had forced her upstairs, he reminded her. No one had forced those drinks into her hand. The implication was clear. If she spoke up, he would ensure she appeared as the aggressor, not the victim. This stays between us, he insisted, his fingers leaving marks on her arm. For Jason's sake. In the weeks that followed, Natalie experienced her home as a prison. She volunteered for extra shifts at the hospital, joined committees that met after work, invented errands that kept her away until Jason returned home. But avoidance proved impossible in the shared house with its suddenly too narrow hallways and too thin walls. David found ways to isolate her, casual touches when Jason's back was turned, whispered comments when passing in the hallway, meaningful glances across the dinner table that made her food turn to ash in her mouth. The pattern established itself with cruel efficiency. David would wait for the nights after Natalie worked overnight shifts, when exhaustion clouded her judgment and weakened her resistance. He would enter her room when Jason worked late, presenting his violations as inevitable, as something they both wanted. His physical strength, honed through decades of athletic coaching, rendered her attempts at resistance futile. His psychological manipulation, the continued threats of exposure, of destroying Jason's career and their marriage, kept her silent. The vibrant, confident nurse gradually disappeared. Natalie's colleagues noticed her withdrawal, the dark circles beneath her eyes, her flinching response to unexpected touch, but attributed these changes to the stresses of her demanding job. Jason sensed the shift in his wife but accepted her explanations of work pressure and fatigue. Only David seemed pleased by her transformation, by the way her eyes now lowered in his presence, by her compliance born of fear and shame. At night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Natalie would stare at the ceiling and contemplate her impossible situation. To speak the truth would shatter Jason's world. To remain silent meant continuing to endure the unendurable, trapped in a home that had become the site of ongoing trauma. The walls that should have provided safety instead contained her nightmare. The man who should have been family had become her predator. And the husband who would protect her remained oblivious to the betrayal occurring under his own roof. By early spring, Natalie's body began to betray her in ways she couldn't ignore. The fatigue came first, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. Then night sweats appeared, leaving her sheets damp by morning. Weight dropped from her already slender frame, uniform scrubs hanging loose where they once fit perfectly. A persistent cough developed, lingering for weeks despite over-the-counter remedies. Her colleagues at Mapleton General noticed. Sandra, the charge nurse who had mentored Natalie since her first day, pulled her aside during a rare quiet moment in the ICU. With blunt concern, she commented on Natalie's appearance and asked if she'd seen a doctor herself. Natalie brushed it off with the practiced dismissal of medical professionals who make the worst patients. Just stress, she insisted. Just exhaustion from her shifts. Dr. Richards, the unit's medical director, wasn't as easily satisfied when he found Natalie leaning against the wall during rounds, her face pale and glistening with sweat. He ordered her to take the rest of her shift off and get checked out. She made an appointment with her primary physician, expecting a lecture about work-life balance and a prescription for vitamins. Dr. Patel listened to her symptoms, performed a basic examination, and suggested her body was telling her to slow down. Take time off. Rest. Reduce stress. Natalie filled the vitamin prescription, started a meditation app, and waited for her body to recover its strength. It didn't. Instead, new symptoms emerged, swollen lymph nodes in her neck and underarms, a persistent low-grade fever, and a rash across her chest that seemed to appear overnight. 2 weeks later, during a particularly brutal shift in which 2 patients crashed simultaneously, Natalie's hands trembled so badly she couldn't place an 4-line. Rachel, a fellow nurse and the closest thing Natalie had to a confidant, took over without comment. After the crisis passed, Rachel pulled her into an empty supply closet. This wasn't stress or exhaustion, Rachel insisted firmly. Something was wrong, and she was going to draw Natalie's blood right then. Rachel's insistence broke through Natalie's denial. She sat silently as her friend prepared the collection tubes, marking them only with an identification number rather than Natalie's name. A small mercy that would keep her results private in a hospital where everyone knew everyone else's business. 3 days later, Rachel found Natalie in the hospital cafeteria and wordlessly handed her a sealed envelope. The look in her eyes told Natalie everything she needed to know before opening it. In the single-stall bathroom down the hall, Natalie read the results twice, certain she'd misunderstood. The black letters remained unchanged on the second reading. HIV positive. The room tilted. It wasn't possible. She'd only been with Jason since they'd started dating 3 years ago. Before him, a long-term boyfriend in nursing school. Each relationship overlapping by exactly 0 partners. Each relationship including the standard testing that healthcare workers underwent regularly. Each test, until now, negative. Natalie's mind rebelled against the implication her medical training immediately presented. There was only one explanation, one vector of transmission. The assaults that had begun that night after the championship party. David. She left work without explanation, driving home mechanically as her thoughts fractured and reformed. The empty house offered temporary sanctuary as she curled on the bathroom floor, her body racked with sobs that came from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond conscious thought. When she could breathe again, Natalie called the hospital lab directly, using her employee access to request Jason's immediate testing. His cooperation would require explanation, but she couldn't form the necessary words yet. Instead, she texted him with an emergency, asking him to come home immediately and go to the hospital with her. Jason arrived 20 minutes later, face tight with worry. She handed him the lab results silently and watched as confusion transformed to shock on his expressive face. He whispered that it couldn't be right, that it must be a mistake. Natalie told him, her voice hollow, that he needed to get tested right away. At the hospital, Rachel helped expedite Jason's blood draw. They waited in a private consultation room, neither speaking, both understanding that words were inadequate for this moment. The rapid test results came back negative. Jason's blood showed no trace of HIV infection, despite 3 years of marriage, despite their lack of protection since they'd been trying for a baby this past year. Statistically improbable. Medically telling. The drive home passed in silence. Jason's knuckles white on the steering wheel, Natalie's mind racing through impossible conversations and unbearable revelations. She needed to tell him everything. The assaults. The threats. The months of silent suffering. But the words stuck in her throat, blocked by shame and fear that had become her constant companions. They arrived home to find David's truck in the driveway. Jason turned to her, his face questioning. Natalie whispered that she couldn't face him yet, but avoidance proved impossible. David stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just collapsed around Natalie. He looked up as they entered, his smile faltering at their expressions. With feigned fatherly concern, he asked what was wrong. Something broke in Natalie then, the final thread of composure snapping under the weight of his pretense. She threw her lab results onto the counter between them and stated, with surprising steadiness, that he had done this to her. David glanced at the paper, then back at Natalie with an expression she couldn't immediately identify. Not shock, not remorse. Something closer to resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Jason looked between his wife and father in confusion. David sighed, placing down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. He'd wondered when this might happen, he admitted. The simple acknowledgement confirmed everything. Jason stepped back as if physically struck, his voice rising as he asked if his father knew he was HIV positive. David nodded, his demeanor strangely calm. He'd found out about 5 years ago, Around the time Martha got sick, he explained. When Jason asked incredulously why he'd never said anything or sought treatment, David merely shrugged, saying he'd made his peace with it. Then his eyes found Natalie's, cold and possessive. Now she understood, didn't she? Now she could never really leave this family. They were bound together permanently. The kitchen tilted sideways as Natalie processed his words, the deliberate infection, the ultimate act of possession. Jason's confusion gave way to dawning horror as he looked between them, demanding to know what his father meant by that. The tears came then, unstoppable. Months of silence crumbled as Natalie finally spoke the truth, about the championship party, about the assaults that followed, about the threats and manipulation that had kept her prisoner in her own home. With each revelation, Jason seemed to physically diminish, his broad shoulders curving inward as if trying to shield himself from blows. Jason stood motionless, his face a battlefield of emotions. Disbelief, rage, betrayal, grief. Finally, he turned to his father, the man he had idolized his entire life, the man who now stood revealed as a monster wearing familiar skin. The single word, Dad, contained a lifetime of questions. The kitchen remained silent for what seemed like hours after Natalie's confession. Jason's face had drained of all color, his knuckles white as he gripped the counter for support. David stood unmoving, his expression betraying neither remorse nor concern, merely the calm calculation of a man who had expected this moment and prepared for it. When Jason finally spoke, his voice emerged as a whisper that gradually built to a roar. He hurled questions at his father, who absorbed the verbal assault with the same detached composure he'd shown on the football field during losing games. These things happen, David explained with a shrug. Jason would understand someday when he was older, how men have certain needs, how Natalie had reminded him so much of Martha. Jason lunged across the kitchen, fists raised, only stopping when Natalie grabbed his arm. Violence wouldn't solve anything, she reminded him. They needed to leave. That night, they packed essentials into 2 suitcases and drove to a motel on the edge of town. The dingy room with its sagging mattress represented freedom, however temporary. They sat side by side on the bed, making plans in hushed voices. They would find an apartment, adjust their budget, start over. Jason would request a transfer to another school district. Natalie would look for nursing positions in neighboring towns. Reality intruded the next morning. Every affordable apartment required first and last month's rent plus security deposit, funds they didn't have after spending their savings on wedding expenses and medical bills. Jason's teaching contract bound him to Mapleton High until June, 3 months away. Breaking it would mean surrendering his teaching license. Natalie's medical benefits, which she desperately needed now, were tied to her position at Mapleton General. Worse, David had anticipated their flight. He called the principal, the superintendent, even the school board president, all longtime friends, expressing concern about Jason's mental state. He contacted the hospital administration, hinting at Natalie's medical condition that might compromise patient care. He reached out to landlords across 3 towns, mentioning his son's young wife who had problems. After a week in the motel, their credit card declined. Jason and Natalie returned to the house on Elmwood Drive. David welcomed them with apparent warmth, as if nothing had happened. Just a father glad to have his family home. Spring advanced into early summer. Natalie's health deteriorated as the virus took hold. Fatigue and recurrent infections forced her to reduce her hours at the hospital. Dark circles formed permanent shadows beneath her eyes. She moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding David's presence whenever possible, sleeping fitfully beside Jason who often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, something hard and unfamiliar forming in his usually gentle eyes. Jason no longer spoke to his father except when absolutely necessary. His colleagues at school noticed the change. The English teacher known for his patience and enthusiasm now moved through hallways with rigid posture and tightly controlled expressions. His lessons continued, but the creative spark that had made him a favorite among students dimmed to mechanical competence. In late June, the annual neighborhood barbecue arrived, a tradition David had always hosted. This year, David insisted on maintaining normalcy. Neighbors filled the backyard, drinking beer and praising David's grilled steaks. They commented on Natalie's weight loss, assuming diet rather than illness. They noted Jason's silence, attributing it to end-of-school-year exhaustion. Beneath the surface of casual conversation and laughter, tension crackled between the three Millers, visible only to those who knew to look for it. During the party, while searching for extra serving platters in David's home office, Jason discovered a locked drawer in the desk. His father's absence at the grill provided opportunity. The thin metal bent easily under pressure from a letter opener. Inside, a leather-bound journal chronicled David's thoughts since Martha's passing. The early entries showed grief and loneliness. Then Jason's engagement to Natalie appeared, along with observations of her laugh, her figure, her resemblance to a younger Martha. Most disturbing were the later entries, after they had moved in. Plans carefully documented, calculations methodically recorded. Ways to separate Natalie from Jason. References to sleeping medication added to her drinks. Detailed descriptions of nights when Jason worked late. The discovery of his HIV diagnosis and the deliberate decision to withhold treatment, to use it as the ultimate binding agent. It had never been impulsive. Every violation had been planned with meticulous care. Jason replaced the journal exactly as he'd found it, rejoined the party with mechanical smiles, and excused himself early, claiming a headache. The next morning, while Natalie slept and David attended a coach's meeting, he drove 40 miles to a hardware store where no one would recognize him. He purchased rat poison, garden gloves, and a new set of measuring spoons, paying cash. That evening, Jason suggested a family dinner. Perhaps they should try to talk things through, find some way forward. David agreed readily, pleased by what he perceived as his son's capitulation. Natalie watched silently as Jason prepared his father's favorite meal, a recipe Martha had perfected years ago. She noticed how carefully Jason measured each ingredient, how he insisted on serving his father personally, how he watched David eat with an intensity that might have been mistaken for reconciliation rather than what it truly was. The cold focus of a man who had made a decision from which there would be no return. David Miller died on a Tuesday morning in July. Natalie found him in his bedroom, his face contorted in pain, his body cold. The paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. The attending physician noted apparent cardiac arrest, unsurprising for a man in his 50s who lived on red meat and whiskey. A sad but natural end. The death certificate would have been signed without question if not for Detective Michael Harmon's instincts. Harmon, a 20-year veteran of Mapleton's small police force, had played football under Coach Miller decades earlier. Something about the scene bothered him, the partially eaten meal on the nightstand, the prescription bottles too neatly arranged, Jason's flat effect when answering questions about his father's final hours. Details that seemed insignificant individually, but collectively raised quiet alarms in the detective's mind. The autopsy, standard for unattended deaths, revealed inflammation of the stomach lining and kidney damage inconsistent with heart failure. The toxicology report, delayed by 2 weeks due to backlog at the state lab, identified thallium compounds typically found in commercial rodenticides. The death was reclassified as homicide. When Harmon returned to the house on Elmwood Drive with a warrant, Jason met him at the door with resignation rather than surprise. In the small interrogation room at the police station, Jason spoke for 6 hours without a lawyer present. He described the assaults on his wife, the deliberate HIV infection, the journal that documented it all. His voice remained steady until he recounted returning home from the hardware store, measuring the poison into his father's food, watching him eat it. Then the composure crumbled, replaced by something between remorse and vindication. The story exploded beyond Mapleton's boundaries. Local news vans parked on Elmwood Drive gave way to national network trucks with satellite dishes. Reporters ambushed hospital staff seeking information about Natalie's condition. School board meetings descended into shouting matches between those who viewed Jason as a monster and those who saw a husband protecting his wife from unimaginable horror. The trial began in November. Jason's attorney pursued a temporary insanity defense against the prosecutor's first-degree murder charge. The courtroom fell silent when Natalie took the stand, her testimony a clinical recounting of violation and trauma delivered in the measured tones of her nursing training. She described the assaults, the manipulation, the diagnosis, the discovery that it had all been calculated by the man her husband had idolized. When asked if she had known about Jason's plan, She looked directly at the jury and answered truthfully. No, but she wasn't surprised, and she couldn't claim she would have stopped him if she had known. David's journal became the trial's central exhibit. Page after page of meticulous documentation of his desires, his actions, his intentional use of HIV as a means of control. Psychiatric experts struggled to classify what the journal revealed. Not a traditional sexual predator profile, not quite a stalker, something uniquely calculated in its cruelty and sense of entitlement. The defense psychiatrist testified that reading the journal had left her unable to sleep for 3 nights. National media personalities debated the case nightly on cable news panels. A violated woman, a deliberate infection with a potentially deadly virus, a husband driven to extremes. The elements tapped into primal questions about justice, revenge, and the limitations of the legal system. Legal analysts questioned whether existing laws adequately addressed the unique cruelty of using HIV as a weapon. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the case as evidence that sexual assault within families remained woefully underaddressed by both social services and law enforcement. The jury deliberated for 38 hours over 5 days. Their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder with a recommendation for leniency in sentencing, reflected the community's divided heart. The judge, bound by mandatory minimums, sentenced Jason to 12 years with possibility of parole after 8, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances while affirming that vigilante justice could not be sanctioned. Natalie sold the house on Elmwood Drive before the trial ended. The proceeds established a foundation providing support for survivors of sexual assault, particularly focusing on marital and family abuse. From a small office in a neighboring county, she coordinated support groups, educational outreach, and emergency housing for women escaping situations similar to what she had endured. Each anniversary of David's death, she received yellow roses anonymously from varied locations across the state, always the same number as years Jason had served of his sentence. On visiting days at the medium-security prison 2 hours from Mapleton, Natalie and Jason sat across from each other at metal tables. Their conversations were about small things, her health management, his prison GED tutoring program, books they had both read. They never discussed that final family dinner or the night that had preceded it, when Jason had silently placed the journal he'd discovered on their bed, and Natalie had read it without comment before returning it to him with a single nod. The Miller case faded from national headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, but in Mapleton, its shadow lingered. The high school discontinued the Coach Miller Excellence Award. Neighbors who had enjoyed his barbecues found themselves unable to speak his name. Students who had believed in Jason's gentle wisdom wondered how thoroughly they could ever know anyone. And in small whispers, people asked themselves what they might have done in Jason's position, and whether they could honestly claim they would have chosen differently.